I'm Sienna. I'm the kid.
I'm Sarah. I'm the mom.
This is Queer Kid Straight Mom.
Let's talk. Welcome back to Queer Kid Straight Mom. Today, we are talking about the Hunger Games series.
I have said this every episode, I think, for the last 3 episodes, but if you haven't read Hunger Games, go read Hunger Games. I realize that it feels overhyped, but it is so deeply relevant to everything that's going on right now, and also just human nature in general. Like, I promise it's worth your time.
I just finished Sunrise on the Reaping, right on deadline, so I'm up to date.
I should warn everyone that this is not a spoiler-free discussion, so if you don't want to be spoiled, pause, go read the books, and then come back and listen to it. But yeah, we're going to be talking about the way that queerness comes up in the world of the Hunger Games, basically, because I think it's a really interesting example, both of the ways that subconscious biases can sort of come up without people really noticing, and then also B, the way that authors can learn from that and be better.
Or not, looking at you, J.K. Rowling.
Yes, Suzanne Collins is doing a good job of showing how not to be like J.K. Rowling.
Which deserves props on this show.
Always.
So I guess these books have been written over a big stretch. So going back to the beginning, how do you feel that queerness was represented in the first books, whether intentionally or not intentionally?
So we don't get an explicit reference to queerness until Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which is the second most recent book. It came out in 2020. So obviously that's a big jump, right? From the early 2010s to 2020. There's been a huge shift in the way that queerness is represented in media, like the frequency of its representation, and especially in the young adult genre, which has always been sort of a refuge for queer authors. But in the last, let's say, 10 years or so, I think it's really exploded into a place where, honestly, you might be surprised for there not to be a queer character in a young adult book at this point. So that's when we get our first explicit reference to queerness. But there's a bunch of sort of subtextual, read between the lines kind of things in the original trilogy. That's Hunger Games, Catching Fire, and Mockingjay. First of all, in the way that the Capitol is portrayed overall, which is this sort of place of excess, of extravagance, of over-the-topness. And one of the main ways that that's communicated, and it's shown how, sort of different people in the Capitol are from people in the districts, is that, and for context, if you haven't read the books, but you're still listening to this episode because you just don't care about spoilers, the Capitol is sort of the epicenter of this 300 years in the future world that used to be the United States. So they're the bourgeoisie, I guess. And then meanwhile, the districts are sort of the proletariat, terrible working conditions, starvation, disease, all that stuff. And they provide the goods that sustain the Capitol. So anyway, again, one of the main things that distinguishes people from the Capitol from people from the districts is the way that they dress. They're described as being just so totally over the top, wigs and makeup and tattoos. And, some people modify themselves to look like animals. And it's just, totally nuts.
Very flamboyant.
Yes, flamboyant. That's the word I was looking for. So the problem being, right, that part of that is also that men do this as well. And that's, again, one of the distinguishing things. Men also care about their appearance, and men also wear makeup. And obviously, once you get into thinking about how the queer community is sort of represented, the way that queer men are understood, especially in media, is that same kind of flamboyance. I think the easiest way to think about it is just to watch the movie and be like, wow, everyone in the Capitol looks really gay. And then to add on to that, there's this kind of element of the male characters who are sort of taken seriously from the Capitol. I'm thinking mainly of President Snow, who's sort of our big bad of the series, and then Cinna, who is sort of Katniss's main ally and friend in the Capitol. those are the two male characters who are described as more subdued, as not having that level of extravagance and flamboyance in the way they present themselves. Katniss specifically notices when she sees Cinna for the first time, he's surrounded by all of these people who have pink wigs with light up mice and, bright purple lipstick and, gold face tattoos, that the only sort of modification that he's made to his body is just having some gold eyeliner on, which for the Capitol is really chill, really sedate. I don't think it's intentional at all, but it really reinforces this notion, A, that caring about your appearance, that, putting effort into your appearance, that presenting yourself in a more extravagant, flamboyant way is sort of inherently unserious and problematic, or at the expense of other people's well-being.
Like when they do the interviews and all the shows, all the theatrical stuff, and Caesar Flickerman, who's played really well by Stanley Tucci, but he's very sort of effeminate and over dramatic and all of the things that you would be like, oh, that's the gay host of a game show, right?
Right. Yeah, every single, again, with a couple of exceptions of the characters who are taken seriously, every single male person from the Capitol is aggressively gay coded.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's really unfortunate to have that kind of representation, because when you think about where these sort of notions, the over the topness, the campiness that we associate with queer people today, where a lot of that comes from is ball culture, which we've done an episode on. So go back and check that out if you're interested. But which was coming out of really poor, underserved Black and brown communities who were making do with effectively leftovers, right? So it's not something that came out of wastefulness or exploitativeness. It's something that came out of thriftiness and making do with what you had to make yourself beautiful and embrace your identity. And so I think it's really sad that that sort of gets reduced to this, this fast fashion-y, over the top nonsense.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. You could see then with it presented that way, with these characters portrayed that way, and you watch these movies and you're from, say, Appalachia, which is, what Katniss's District 12 seems to be based on. So if you're a conservative person from Appalachia and you see these movies, you're like, oh, yes, the point of this is the liberal, crazy, over-the-top elites in the cities are keeping us down and abusing us. And all of those people with their lifestyles and their clothes and their, all of that. You could see it wasn't intentional, but I could see how it could be misinterpreted that way.
Right, especially because, I think yes, District 12 is meant to be the Appalachian region. And then the Capitol it's not as specific, but more or less where Denver is. And so you can see, again, yeah, this idea that, oh, we have this sort of liberal bastion of the Rockies. Yeah, it's again, I think really unfortunate. Given the rest of the messaging of the books, I don't think it was intentional at all. But yeah, and that's the thing, right? There is no mention of queerness of any kind that I can think of throughout. And I did just reread the first book and the second book, and I'm halfway through the third book. And no mention of queerness in the districts at all until there's this weird dynamic going on with one of the victors of the 65th Hunger Games, Finnick Odair, who Katniss initially thinks of as this just absolute peacock, so over the top, total showboat. And one of his defining characteristics to her is that he has this sort of parade of lovers in the Capitol. And I think it's very deliberately, throughout the couple of books where it's mentioned, it's very deliberately not women. It's really gender ambiguous. The suggestion, my interpretation is that it's saying that, he was in relationships with both men and women.
I think it mentioned that in the movie, right? I think they say both men and women would buy his services or whatever.
I think they do say that, because I thought it was in the book as well, and then I was reading that scene last night and it didn't explicitly say it, but I do think it's explicit in the movie. Right. Where then in Mockingjay we find out that, oh, it's not that he's been in all of these, sort of flash in the pan relationships. It's that he was considered attractive in the Capitol, and so Snow would basically prostitute him. which A is horrible.
Yeah.
And B is, again, I think playing into this really unfortunate dynamic of, oh, the only character with any connection to queerness from the districts is someone who has been exploited by the capital.
It's just what they all think is going on in the cities, right?
Right, exactly. And so overall, this actually makes sense when you think about what Suzanne Collins was doing when she built the Capitol, because it's very much inspired by ancient Rome, right? Funny side note, almost every single character from the Capitol, with the exception of Plutarch Heavensbee and Effie Trinket, almost every other character, their names are drawn directly from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar play. That's not really, like, important, but it is random. I noticed it when I was reading Julius Caesar. Anyway.
Oh, I just found that out at trivia. Remember a couple weeks ago, I said there was like an obscure Shakespeare tragedy that there was a character named Cressida.
Yeah.
So just they're all from Shakespeare in one form or another, except for those two.
Plutarch is a Roman historian. So I don't know where Effie Trinket came from.
Hard saying.
Anyway, moving on. There's a sort of dynamic in ancient Rome, actually in a lot of ancient empires, where I say queerness sort of in a not conforming to our current understandings of, like, normal sexual and gender presentation, because, like, most of these things are not things that would be interpreted the way we interpret the idea of queerness today. But there was a sort of dynamic where, in particular, men having relationships with other men was not necessarily looked down on, so long as it sort of adhered to certain dynamics, like sexual dynamics, because it was sort of seen as a form of exercise of power, basically. So it was also associated with excess. Like, oh, you have so much social power that you can have 3 boyfriends in addition to your wife? Wow, so impressive. And again, like, that's, there's also a very similar dynamic in Chinese history where, people didn't really care who a man was having sex with outside of his wife so long as he produced heirs. So again, it's a mechanism for demonstrating social dominance. And it was associated with, basically, in Chinese history, the point where your court is just full of a bunch of dudes lounging around and, like, looking at pictures of attractive people and having sex. That was seen as sort of like, oh, this empire is getting too old for its own good, and it's time for the dynastic cycle to renew itself. There was a not great summary, but it's something that anyone who's interested in can for sure go look up, because there's really interesting philosophy surrounding renewal of empire in Chinese history. But point being, there's this trend in human history of specifically men having sex with less socially powerful men as A, being considered very normal, and B, being associated with excess and sort of the pride before the fall, right? That society is sort of at this peak of opulence and extravagance, and that comes right before the Roman Empire comes crashing down, or, the Chinese dynasty falls, like, whatever it may be. But that's, like, a trend that exists in human history. And so I think that's sort of maybe subconsciously what Suzanne Collins was drawing on when she wrote these books.
And not that it's because of a moral judgment, but because it's like a sign of complacency.
Right. That it was basically in the same category as having lots of concubines, right?
So drawing on all of this historic stuff that a lot of the people that would have read these books, seen these movies, wouldn't be aware of. And so it's easier to just interpret it as, oh, the Capitol represents everything that's bad.
Right. Exactly. When in actuality, here's an interesting thing. There is a theory, and it's really difficult to prove because of all the weird translation stuff and weird cultural stuff that the Bible has gone through. But there's a theory out there that one of the Bible verses that's often cited in, like, opposition to homosexuality says, like, you shall not lie with a man as you lie with a woman, or whatever, or something along those lines. There's a theory out there that where that is coming from is, like, you shall not lie with boys the way that you lie with women, that it was actually meant to be attacking that power imbalance.
Mm-hmm.
which I think we can all agree is a good thing, right?
Right.
And that it got mistranslated. But right, that's what it's all about. It's not that there's something inherently wrong with queerness or men having sex with other men. It's that there were power dynamics that were being exploited very similarly, actually, to the way that men would exploit their power over women.
Right.
And I think the reason that a lot of people perceive it as so unnatural is because in this case, it's a boy being relegated to the same status as a woman.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
So, right. So it is problematic, but not in the sense of queerness, in the sense of that's creepy and abusive.
Yes. And while it may be okay to treat your wife that way, it's not okay to treat men that way.
Right. Obviously.
Super.
So, yeah, I mean, the goal is to be representing that power imbalance, I think, on Collins' part. Unfortunately, it just gets all mucked up in her maybe not being super familiar with some of the dynamics within the queer community, with like what's important, and, you know, probably just like thinking about, like, again, in early 2010s when she wrote this, like probably not thinking about representing the queer community the way that you might think about it today.
Right. Okay, so fast forwarding to these last two books, Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and Sunrise on the Reaping. What did you see in Suzanne Collins's approach that changed?
So, like I said, Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is when we get our first explicit, like, reference to actual, like, what we would understand as queer characters today. And the first one is a reference to a couple of guys from the Capitol who are in a relationship, which, okay, not so much subverting the same thing that we've set up in the last three books. But I think we do get one reference to, I think, one of Lucy Gray's cousins being interested in a girl, like her female cousin is interested in, you know, dating a girl, really, really passing reference. Well, then in Sunrise on the Reaping, we get this very explicit scene where Haymitch is talking about his girlfriend, Lenore Dove's. Is it Lenore or Lenore?
Honestly, I was going to ask you if you knew.
Based on my reading of the poem, I think Lenore would be more rhythmically appropriate.
Okay.
Lenore Dove's uncles. This is very sad. I initially was like, oh, uncles, like maybe they're gay. It turns out, yes, but also no, because they're both just her uncles, presumably from, like, you know, their brothers or their opposite sides of the family or whatever. However, he's talking about one of them in particular, Clerk Carmen, and he's relaying this conversation he had with Lenore Dove, where he was like, ugh, Clerk Carmen doesn't want us to be together because he thinks I'm a troublemaker. I think he just hates love. And Lenore Dove said, well, no, actually, he's been in a relationship for ages with this guy from across town, but, like, the peacekeepers will beat you up if you're in a relationship they don't perceive as being acceptable. So
That's what I was thinking. That's what I was going to ask you about. Do you think that was a intentional choice to, like, point out that that's not okay with the peacekeepers? That's not okay with the Capitol.
yeah. And I've seen some really interesting analysis of this because, again, obviously, queerness is not, or at least, like, broadly speaking, gender nonconformity is not seen as a problem in the Capitol. So what makes it problematic for people in the district is obviously it's just a way of exercising power over them, right? So we've now taken this dynamic of we're exercising power over you via sexual abuse to also power can be exercised through controlling your sexuality the other direction, right? And I don't know if that was a deliberate choice to engage with that idea on her part. I mean, she's brilliant, so maybe it was. But I also, like, I haven't seen a ton of conversation around the way that queerness is portrayed in the original trilogy, so I don't know if it was something that was even really on her radar. But regardless, I do think it's a really important thing to include because it shows, again, that it's about exercising power over people. It's not about queerness itself. It's about what are ways that we can keep these people under our boot.
Right.
I also saw someone point out that, like, population dynamics are also a kind of an underlying point of concern for everyone, in less so in the districts because they just want to like stay alive, but for the capital and District 13 as well, which is kind of the district that ends up leading the revolution, that there are these sort of casual, like occasional references slipped into, oh, this is like the population, oh, workforce, oh, the disease decimated the population and they need new breeding stock. So a reason that the capital might tolerate non-conforming behavior in its own population, but not in the districts, is because in its own population, like, they don't really care. They're just having a good time. But in the districts, they need people to be reproducing because, like, they're effectively treated like slaves.
I just started watching The Handmaid's Tale, and I know I'm late to the show, but this is alarmingly reminiscent.
I mean, there's been a lot of conversation about that recently surrounding the reproductive rights conversation, where, like, the same people who have no problem with Black babies dying in childbirth and brown kids starving on the streets and bombing brown kids around the planet are so upset at the idea that a white woman might choose not to have kids. Because, yeah, it's, again, reproduction and people's, like, sex lives are directly linked to these mechanisms of power. And so people who are concerned with upholding their power over a particular group are always going to be interested in keeping their own reproductive rates high and suppressing the reproductive rights of other people, or using those people's reproduction for their own means. And, like, it's something that you see all the time in accounts of slavery, right? Where the status of a baby where one of its parents were slaves would follow the mother. And that is because mostly Black men weren't having sex with white women. Like, that was something that was very aggressively forbidden. The echoes of that you see in the Emmett Till case, right? Where, like, Black kids would get murdered for whistling at a white woman. But white men were having a ton of sex with enslaved women. Because they viewed those women as there for their sexual gratification. And so by establishing that rule, that meant that not only could they rape these Black women whenever they felt like it, but whatever child might come of that would then go towards their own pool of slaves, which is very messed up, but I think it reinforces my point here.
Yeah. So this is all very interesting in the context of the current administration, because it's almost like, along with Project 2025, they have, like, Hunger Games on their shelves as a model moving forward in some ways. Obviously, that's, like, over the top. But, like, now you look at the White House. I don't know if you've seen pictures of the Oval Office lately, but there's, like, gaudy, ornate gold stuff everywhere in there. And Trump is always, and I'm not trying to criticize women's appearances, because I don't like going there to criticize the job they're doing. But he is surrounded by a lot of women that have had a lot of work done on their faces. There's a lot of plastic surgery. And it's not as much trying to make yourself look distinctive and interesting as it was in the Capitol. It's more like everybody's trying to look exactly the same. There's a lot of stuff happening, the extravagance, the sort of, we can spend money on all of this. Like, you do all of those things to show how wealthy you are, right? I'm not aging. I'm keeping my face looking what is supposed to be the same and isn't really the same, but it's not all wrinkly, I guess. But, like, I'm not going to age like everybody else because I'm rich enough not to, right?
Yeah, I mean, what it is it's about, fundamentally, the Capitol is about, like, the extreme concentration of wealth to the point where, yeah, you can just throw away money on whatever you want, on the most inane, useless things. I think a really, really good example of that is in Catching Fire, when Katniss and Peeta are at this big party at the president's mansion, and there's all this great food, and eventually they're like, oh, we can't eat anymore. We're just completely full. And then the people from the Capitol are like, oh, look, we have this thing that'll make you throw up. So you, like, throw up all the food you already ate so you can just eat more food. And meanwhile, people in the districts are literally starving to death.
Yeah.
That feels very extreme, but it's not that far off from what people, like, what happens. And what's really interesting is that it happens in this country. Like, you have the top 1% and the bottom 25%, and, like, the radical difference in living standards there. But also, on a more macro level, the United States versus the entire rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the wastefulness, right? That you have a group hoarding everything for themselves and they would rather waste it and throw it away on stupid stuff than share it.
Right. Obviously, there's a lot in Sunrise on the Reaping that is very deliberately targeted in current events. Because, Suzanne Collins has said she only is interested in writing more books if she thinks there's something important to write about. So, like, an example of that is there's a line in there about AI at one point. But one that I absolutely loved was Haymitch is talking about how Lenore Dove's family, because they're all musicians, Lenore Dove's family will perform for peacekeepers. And Lenore Dove is like, I don't want to perform for peacekeepers. Like, they're the tool of our oppression. And then her uncles are like, well, maybe it'll foster some goodwill towards us. And like, everyone likes music. And then Haymitch thinks something along the lines of, yeah, well, everyone likes, kids not dying and getting to keep living. But nonetheless, which I thought was just such a clever way of slipping in there a critique of this idea that, like, if you just work with the oppressors and you're just nice to them and you just show them that you're one of the good ones, maybe they'll, like, realize that you're actually people. Like, no, they won't. The point at which someone is okay with the stuff that's going on makes them so far beyond the pale that, like, you playing a song for them is not going to help.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot in there in that particular book about Plutarch questioning Haymitch in training. Like, well, why do you? Why don't you take the opportunity to fight back? Why, if the thoughts crossed your mind, why don't you do something? And the sort of helplessness, but that starts to build throughout the book of like, why do we just put up with this? Why are we staying in this place? And, the obvious answer by the end of the book being because they'll kill everyone you love if you don't.
Right. And so it's for a little bit of context, again, for people who aren't familiar. Sunrise on the Reaping is a prequel about one of the victors of the 50th Hunger Games, who is Katniss and Peeta's mentor in the original 3 books. It's the story of how he became a victor. And it's so fascinating the way it recontextualizes everything from the first 3 books. Like, just absolutely brilliant, because something I think Suzanne Collins does really, really well. It happened in Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes as well, where you are a little bit like, this doesn't make sense. What is going on here? This is really weird. I don't understand what she's trying to do. And then when you actually like get through the book and you start processing, you're like, oh. So, like, in the case of Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, you are reading and you're like, what is this? Is she trying to make Snow some kind of like romantic hero who just like is sad because he got jilted by this girl? And then you're like, oh no, it's actually all about how, again, these power dynamics of how he felt entitled to her, basically, because of his position of power. And then in the case of Sunrise on the Reaping, what it does is, and this is probably more the case if you're like if you are really familiar with the original books, but there are all these things where you're like, wait, that's not what I remember. What did she forget what happened? Like, oh, that line feels really shoehorned in there. Like, that doesn't make sense in this context at all. And then you get to the end and you're like, oh my God, no, this lines up perfectly. It's just the way that the Capitol has manipulated the information that they received in the original trilogy. So, like, because Katniss and Peeta went back and watched Haymitch's games in Catching Fire, and, like, none of the stuff that happens in the bulk of Sunrise on the Reaping comes up in there, but it's because they were watching the Capitol propaganda version.
Oh, this is all just a little too real, I gotta say. So obviously the reference we were sort of making to J.K. Rowling is that, and I guess it's a little different because it's because of the things that she said after the fact that you look back and find the things that are problematic in her books.
Entirely though. Like, there were plenty of things that people pointed out as being kind of uncomfortable or problematic, like even before she turned into a complete nut job online.
Yeah, but now she's just doubled down on all of it because that's who she is, apparently.
Right. Well, and for like also that Suzanne Collins doesn't feel the need to be like defending herself on Twitter and like whatever. She's like, I'm going to engage with these ideas in the work that I produce, as an artist does. And I'm going to let readers interpret it as they will.
Which is good. We like that.
The moral of the story is, if you're a creator, be like Suzanne Collins. Don't be like J.K. Rowling.
We do love to say our piece about J.K. Rowling on this show. If you have not read them, we'll say it again. Go read them. Really fascinating, especially like if you haven't, now you have some interesting context. Put it all in as you read it.
I'm going to ask that you do put the time in to read the books before you watch the movies, because you will get a very different perspective. I think the movies, are reasonably well done, but you do lose a lot of like important detail.
On our next episode, we are going to talk about brands again. We kind of end up doing this toward Pride Month every year, but this year in particular, there have been some shakeups with corporations that have sponsored Pride deciding they're not going to anymore. So it's just worth a revisit as we look at, companies like Target that are being boycotted for backing off of DEI, and, the companies that don't want to sponsor Pride. The different reactions to fear of this administration that we're seeing in companies. And we just want to be able to like point some of them out and give credit to the companies that are standing firm. Happy beginnings of spring. We'll catch you next time.
Bye.
If you found this episode interesting, informative, amusing, please review and follow us on your podcasting platform of choice. Getting those reviews and follows really helps us show up more in the algorithm and be able to reach more people to help them. You can find us on social media, Instagram and Threads at queerkid.straightmom, Blue Sky at qksm.bsky.social, and Facebook at Queer Kid Straight Mom. We are no longer on Twitter.
And if you're feeling especially generous, please consider joining our Patreon by searching Queer Kids Straight Mom. It helps us fund this podcast.